then fully merge with Dewey Academy for the fall of 2023. Next slide, please. Dewey is projected to serve 121 students and is located in District 2. Similar to Bunch, the recommendation for Dewey is to move to Westlake for this upcoming school year and then merge with Bunch in the fall of 2023. This proposal to co-locate, then merge after 1 year is for the Dewey and Bunch school communities to have a design year to plan for how to merge. Community Day School is projected to serve 9 students and is located in District 6. The recommendation for Community Day School is closure, and students will be referred to the Alameda County program. Next slide, please. Now I will transition to phase 2, implementation in fall of 2023. Horace Mann is projected to serve 179 students and is located in District 4. The recommendation is to close Horace Mann, and the welcoming schools would be Bridges, Global, Markham, Laurel, Allendale, and Lockwood. Manzanita Community is projected to serve 316 students and 39 SCC students. Manzanita Community is located in District 5. The recommendation is that Manzanita Community merge with Fruitvale Elementary on the Fruitvale campus. We have also indicated welcoming schools for Manzanita Community students if families would like another option, and ICS and TCN for the future location of the SCC classes. Next slide, please. Korematsu is projected to serve 187 students and 26 SCC students. Korematsu is located in District 7 and is currently co-located on the Stonehurst campus with Esperanza Elementary. Korematsu is recommended for closure, and the welcoming schools are Esperanza, Madison Primary, Rise New Highland, and Reach. The Miles Moderate program on the campus would remain on the Stonehurst campus and be part of Esperanza Elementary. Our last recommendation is Hillcrest. Hillcrest is projected to serve 93 6th through 8th grade students and is located in District 1. The recommendation is that the grade configuration at Hillcrest be truncated and become a K-5. The intent is to add programming at Hillcrest so that Hillcrest serves special education students and potentially add a TK program, making Hillcrest a TK through 5th grade school. Thank you for the opportunity to review each school recommendation. Next slide, please. This summary provides changes to school sites by board district member. Next slide, please. And this summary provides you with the total number of changes: 8 closures, 4 mergers, and 2 grade truncations over the next 2 years. 8 closures, 4 mergers. Often, the community comments that if the school site is vacated, the building will sit empty. This resolution calls for a recommendation on our assets to come back to the board in May of 2022, after a decision is made about this recommendation. There are specific steps in our board policy regarding asset management. First step is to identify needs for educational purposes like early childhood, the TK expansion, adult education, and unique special education spaces. The next step is to identify needs for operational support, like professional learning spaces, temporary space during construction projects, or central administration services. The last step is to identify community uses and revenue generation opportunities, such as workforce housing, short-term joint use leases through partnerships with community-based organizations, and/or long-term leases. It is especially important that we identify the strategic use of our facilities so that we are responsible property owners and do not contribute to community blight. We do have educational needs for our buildings and will bring back a recommendation according to the resolution timeline. Next slide, please. The next section of our presentation describes the vision for caring for our students, their families, and our staff through this big transition if these recommendations are implemented. I want to provide the data that many people have commented on during our board meetings, that school changes will impact low-income students of color. I am deeply committed to and cannot stress enough that improvement work our whole district must do to improve the education we provide our students. I agree with many comments that lift up these needs to improve our district. Our district is composed of 86% students who identify as students of color, mostly Latino and African American. We also serve 33% English language learners, 15% of students who receive special education services, and a district average of 79% unduplicated pupil percent. We care deeply for our students' success, and knowing this data and the specific schools that serve a high percentage of our identified student groups is important in our planning to improve our district. Monica Thomas will take us through the vision for supporting our community. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Dr. Aguilera, and good evening, board and community. I'm Monica Thomas, Deputy Chief of Improvement, and I am responsible for school supervision in Network 3 and school improvement district-wide. Here tonight to talk about implementation and next steps regarding the proposed school changes, including our vision for welcoming schools, our plan for case management of students and staff, and our design for continuous improvement at school sites. Next slide, please. As we support families, students, and staff through the process of transitioning school sites, we want receiving schools, which we are calling welcoming schools, to be ready to embrace our community. We want to highlight the incredible richness in our schools and the dedicated staff, outstanding students, and engaged families in our surrounding schools. This is a deeply emotional and raw experience for our community, especially in an already difficult time of weariness. And we want to take care to acknowledge and support families, students, and staff through this process. Next slide, please. We have faced challenges in the past, as well as experienced success in leading through school changes, and it is important that we learn from both. We have done this work before and learned that individual case management for families, as well as staff, is foundational to the support we give. During earlier school changes, we saw increased enrollment at receiving schools, notably at Elmhurst United and Oakland Academy of Knowledge, known as OAK. We have been able to expand offerings and electives, art at Sankofa United, language programming at Frick United, and electives at Elmhurst United. Our data also show that students who transitioned from Roots to welcoming schools received fewer Ds and Fs. And overall, we were able to expand and this is an area we intend to invest in moving forward. Next slide, please. These lessons learned are guiding our vision for how we want this experience to feel, look, and sound for our students, families, and staff. We want them to feel cared for and seen, acknowledged and welcomed, and supported in a seamless way. We want students specifically to see a place for themselves at their new school, with adults who are welcoming them with open arms to support their academic excellence and emotional well-being. And we want them to hear affirmative and loving language in their home language of adults who care deeply for them and are dedicated to ensuring their success. Next slide, please. In order to reach this vision, we are proposing 3 layers of investments at our welcoming sites to support the academic programming, facilities improvement, and school culture needed to support our students. We've highlighted here a few of our welcoming sites: Burkhalter, Oakland Academy of Knowledge, and Madison Primary Academy, who will be preparing to welcome students, families, and staff. Burkhalter, Oakland Academy of Knowledge. The first layer of investment includes facilities improvements at our welcoming schools, specifically playgrounds, landscaping, and painting, to create an intentional, welcoming environment for students. I mentioned earlier how powerful our case management strategy was in the past, and we will continue to invest in this. We want families to have a dedicated person they can count on to help them through the welcoming process, one who speaks their language and who can answer their questions in a timely way. Finally, we plan to invest in relationship building and building strong teams at school sites through professional development and coaching, aimed at improving inclusive practices and accelerated learning. I'd now like to invite Dexter Moore Jr. to share specific investments we intend to make in partnership with the Black Reparations Task Force. Dexter.
Thank you, Monica. Last fall, during our citywide listening campaign, we asked participants to share 3 things required for Black students, staff, and families to thrive in OUSD. As you can expect, we received a wide range of responses from our community. However, there was one recommendation that really captured the story of what we heard from more than 250 community members. A grandmother at a Coma market in East Oakland, right up the street from a childhood home, shared with me her multi-generational OUSD story. While I will not share her exact words, I will share the 2 resounding takeaways from her story and those of the many I listened to. Those takeaways are centered around psychological safety and accountability. As educators, we know that schools should be the safest environments for our students. However, we have learned that that is not always the case for our Black students. Too many do not feel seen, heard, validated, acknowledged, or believe that the adults in the building and the larger school system genuinely care about their well-being. This is compounded by the current context of the difficult decision in front of the board this evening. It also connects to the second theme of accountability. We heard loudly and clearly the need for our system to not simply acknowledge the harm experienced by many in the Black community and the ways in which white supremacist culture ingrained in our system and our individual and collective ways of working, but to invoke the true spirit of reparations and provide clear and concrete ways to redress and commit to reconciliation. I often listen to the damage and deficit-driven language we use to describe and discuss our Black students and the system in which they are harmed. They are often used as the example for why and how things are not working just and equitably in our district. I'd like to disrupt that pattern and briefly speak to the underlying belief that undergirds our strategic plan, our reparations resolution, CCEE report, and many other guiding documents. That is to state that our system is filled with Black excellence, and our Black students, families, and educators and community partners are flowing with beauty, with brilliance, with creativity, and the innate potential to accomplish joy and success beyond their wildest dreams. Black students, families, and educators must be centered in our district's vision and commitment to thriving in a full-service community school district. Last week, my colleagues and I shared our early thinking on Black thriving indicators, and I believe we have an opportunity to directly connect the work of the task force language from the reparations resolution, and priorities outlined in our strategic plan to commit above and beyond investments for Black students matriculating into welcoming schools. These investments and plans for distributing and tracking their use must be a priority for our system if we are going to meet this moment and ensure that many of the one-time funds concretely land with our Black students and families in the district. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. You heard from Monica, there will be foundational investments in welcoming schools to support students and families with the transition and to enhance school programs. Additionally, schools welcoming students from Prescott, Carl Monk, Grass Valley, Parker, and Westlake, schools with large populations of Black students, will receive investments to ensure that we specifically create support and opportunity for our Black students impacted by the consolidations proposed. We are committing targeted investments in two ways: $1 million to site-based reparations committees and $2 million to seed an investment in the Black Thriving Fund. Last week, you heard us preview the recommendation of a site-based reparation committee. One concrete action we can take at our welcoming schools is to provide a targeted multi-year investment that places our Black families in the driver's seat of determining the programs and services that align with those Black Thriving indicators, our reparations resolution, and strategic plan. This committee would monitor the allocation of those resources and ensure they are directly impacting the everyday experiences of our Black students and families. Secondly, our commitment is to direct a $2 million seed investment into the Black Thriving Fund. We are hopeful that this initial investment will allow us to immediately grow this fund by attracting private and philanthropic partnerships. Of course, we acknowledge the necessity to have these proposed investments go through the natural budget development process. However, we remain fully committed to a concrete pathway towards abundance and excellence for the experiences and outcomes of our Black students and families. We will work with the community and task force to bring forth a final budget recommendation in support of our Black students. I will now hand it back to my colleague, Monica Thomas.
Thank you, Dexter, for highlighting the specific ways we are planning to support our Black students and families. Next slide, please. We want to ensure the community that we have identified specific operational steps during the transition process that we will need to take to meet our vision. We know many families have specific questions about the enrollment process if their school is recommended for a closure or merger. And so I'd like to share a little about the case management for students regarding enrollment. We have designated welcoming schools for schools recommended for closure and still know that families go through the options process and may choose differently. For that reason, students attending a school that is closed, merging onto a different site, or as part of a grade configuration change will also receive the opportunity ticket enrollment priority. This goes above neighborhood priority for up to 50% of open seats. Families will be contacted individually to ensure we have their preferences during options. Enrollment staff will call families to see if they would like to change their school choices or re-rank them. If we are not able to contact families through one-on-one outreach, our Student Assignment Center will pre-fill applications with the welcoming schools, plus 3 other closest schools. Our priority is to serve the families whose only choices are closing schools. Long-term, the Student Assignment Office will also begin analysis and collect community input on changes to attendance boundaries for the affected schools. Next slide, please. We also will be supporting staff through this process using a case management approach. Staff will receive personalized one-to-one support from talent 3 to 5 times over the course of the spring semester. This will include ongoing support with understanding their rights and responsibilities in the closure merger process, and connect them with needed resources and information, with the overall priority being to retain staff in our district to reduce our overall vacancies. On average, 91% of staff returned to teach in OUSD after a change at their specific school was implemented. Next slide, please. Some of our welcoming schools will be undergoing redesign, which is an intentional and systematic community process to improve outcomes for students. Schools that will undergo redesign will convene a design team, which is a group of parents, teachers, staff, and students. This design team will work through 3 modules, a snapshot, which is provided here, to develop a shared community vision for student success grounded in our OUSD strategic plan. These activities include leading families and staff through imagining the future for students, planning towards that future, and grounding in best practices to support students and adults in their learning. Relationship building and inclusive practices are at the heart of this work. Next slide, please. And next slide. Finally, I'd like to walk you through implementation steps we will enact for transition to welcoming schools, school mergers, and redesign. For transition to welcoming schools, the work begins with welcome to school plans and professional development for staff. We will initiate a facilities assessment to begin improvements and engage in case management for students and families to enroll at a welcoming school or with an opportunity ticket. Once we get closer to the end of the year, actions include support with packing and unpacking, as well as coordinating move details. Next slide, please. For merging sites, actions include convening a cross-stakeholder design team to support the programmatic integration, as well as ongoing professional development for design leaders. Additionally, staff will receive support for packing and moving, as well as the facilities upgrade. Next slide, please. And finally, as described earlier, our actions to support redesign sites will be to convene a cross-stakeholder design team and lead them through high-quality professional development aimed at developing a shared vision of excellence for students aligned to our OUSD vision and strategic plan. Thank you, and I will now pass it back to our superintendent.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. This concludes the first section of the presentation. We will now transition into the financial analysis of the proposed school consolidation recommendations. At this time, I am going to ask our Chief of Systems and Services Officer, Mr. Preston Thomas, to provide some opening remarks and to introduce our presenters for this section of the presentation.
Good evening. Thank you, Superintendent Johnson-Trammell. Good evening, board and community. My name is Preston Thomas. I'm the Chief Systems and Services Officer. On January 12th, the board approved the resolution that initiated the process that brings us here this evening. The resolution required a financial analysis of the projected ongoing financial impact to the district. Staff worked with Eric Hall and Associates to conduct the analysis. You will be seeing that analysis here tonight. Before this presentation gets started, I did want to share that this analysis does provide an assessment of savings in ongoing funding to address the structural and ongoing fiscal issues the superintendent described in the opening. It also assumes that the district will utilize the various one-time funds that are available to support the mergers and consolidations. This is a different environment for consolidations than in cohort 1 and cohort 2, where we also had to make investments from ongoing funding, which is a significant challenge for an already fiscally challenged district. The savings identified here can be ongoing investments across the system to not only increase compensation, but also invest deeper in student programming and support a smaller number of schools. The board should also note that Community Day School is not included in the analysis as a closure. There's some further work that needs to happen on the enrollment and revenue side between the district and the county program. We will bring that analysis back to the board on February the 8th. With that, I would like to invite Barry Dragon, Rick Holash, and Michael Taylor to come. They're on. Excellent. Barry Dragon is the Vice President of Eric Hall and Associates, and he will introduce you to the team that conducted the independent analysis. And I'll yield the floor over to Mr. Dragon, who will be leading the presentation.
Thank you, Preston. Thank you, President Yee, Vice President Davis, members of the Board of Directors.
Over to Mr. Dragon, who will
We're
be
certainly
leading the
pleased to
presentation.
be able to be here this evening and share the data that we have looked at, the data we have accumulated and sorted through in an attempt to provide you with a financial analysis of the implications of these closures. Next slide, please. So taking you through the agenda, we'll talk about, we'll go through the introductions, myself, my two colleagues, the scope and purpose, what was our scope, some comparative district data. We'll look at some revenue versus expenditure numbers as it relates to the various closures. We'll talk about potential savings of each of the three elements. So we've divided the analysis into three components: the school closure component, the school merger component, and a separate category related to certificated staffing specifically. The first two, being closures and mergers, do not address certificated staffing within them. They're merely both management and classified. We'll summarize our thoughts and then leave it to the board for their questions. Next slide. I, Barry Dragon, have been a CBO, CFO for the last 25 years in both large and medium-sized school districts in the state. And I have a degree in accounting from a time gone by. And with that, I will turn to my colleague, Mr. Michael Taylor, let him give you a few words about himself.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the opportunity to assist you all in this very difficult and complex initiative. 16 years in school business, 9 of those years as a chief business official, and looking forward to going through the slides with you.
Rick?
Well, I'm Rick Holash. Thanks for having us here tonight. I know this is a difficult time for the district. I have 20 years experience in Southern California, either ROP, regional occupational programs, or K-8 districts, 15 years of which I was assistant superintendents. I have a bachelor's degree from Cal State Fullerton, and in 1988, I was certified as a public accountant in the state of California.
Thank you, Rick. Next slide, please. So simply stated, we were asked to perform a financial analysis on the district recommended school sites considered for either closure or merger. Next slide, please. So we did some research on various school districts. You have a list here of 15 school districts of varying sizes, but predominantly on the larger size. We have 3 pieces of information, kind of reading from right to left, if I may. The number of schools is identified through the California Department of Education. The 2020, scratch 2020/21 enrollment, and the average school size. And they are in descending order from Santa Ana with a average school size of 845 down to Oakland with an average school size of 438. Next slide, please. And this is just merely a graphical representation of the same information. Just shows you that obviously there are school districts that have larger average sizes. Now, I'm well aware that a number of years ago, the Oakland Unified School District Board decided to move to the full service community school. So we recognize that part of this is a result of that initiative in an effort to provide more supportive services to our students. This merely just reflects kind of the rest of California in 15 school districts. Next slide. Rick.
Thank you, Barry. This is just, we've worked with Mr. Thomas on this, on how much revenue from the base and supplemental each student brings in at these schools versus how much the expenditures are per student, including the board policy 3150 that has to go back to the district to cover their overheads for loans, for special ed, et cetera, under board policy 3150. And you can see right now, more money is being expended on students than the revenue coming in for those students. Next slide, please.
Yes, so let me kind of as a anticipatory set, we looked at these three various components, as I indicated earlier in the agenda. We have closures, we have mergers, and we have teacher staffing. Closures are school closure with students moving to welcoming schools, as has been articulated by my colleagues at Oakland Unified, and the administrative, clerical, and classified costs. In the center are mergers, those that are sharing a campus, those where two schools are going into one campus, and also the administrative, clerical, and classified costs. And certainly, last but not least, are teacher staffing. The cost savings that would accrue to the district for reinvestment through the mergers or closures. And so what we did was, and Rick will go on and talk about this greater length in a few moments, is in trying to fill the empty seats that currently exist at various of the welcoming schools. Next slide. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, as Mr. Dragon has just mentioned, the three components, the closure, the merger, and the certificated staffing, all projected savings are based on a couple things. One is assumptions and also methodology. And so one of the things that we had to ask ourselves as we conducted the analysis was, how much does it cost to operate a school? And we identified various cost factors, as you can see on the slide: salaries and benefits, material and supplies, operating expenses, and routine restricted maintenance, i.e. The dollars associated with maintaining the facility. So those are the major factors associated with the methodology. We also accounted for attrition loss. So as either schools close or merge, we did account for a percentage decrease in enrollment. And we also, talking about the last bullet, we also wanted to ensure that we identify general fund expenses only. And so because there is Oakland Unified does have a healthy nutrition services program, we made sure to separate nutrition services from the cost factors that we identified. And just as a small correction, the not applicable to mergers language needs to move down one line to material and supplies. The assumption there being that when schools merge, the material and supplies and the operating expenses are probably going to remain the same. Next slide, please. And so in order to identify the cost per school, we developed a cost sheet. And here you have a sample from RISE. And again, the cost factors are identified, salaries and benefits, and you can see quite a bit of granularity here. We have it down to the position and also the average salary and benefit per position. And a good majority of this information that you'll be seeing came directly from the first interim budget submitted to the board back in December of 2021. So this is the first portion of the cost sheet, the salaries and benefits, and the appropriate expenses associated with this particular category. As you notice, the teachers have been zeroed out, and what this cost sheet allows us to do, it gives us the flexibility to take positions in and out. And as Mr. Dragon mentioned at the outset, the closures and the mergers focus specifically on positions in the management and classified areas. Next slide, please. And here you have the other cost factors: material and supplies, operating expenses, routine restricted maintenance, and also accounting for the potential loss in enrollment as a result of a merger or a closure. And so for each one of the schools that have been identified for either closure or for a merger, we have a specific dollar amount associated with each one of those schools. And you'll see that here in the next few slides. Next slide, please. And moving on to the first component in the analysis, which are the closures. Next slide, please. And see, and here you have the range of potential savings in the first component, the closure component, and it ranges from 2.1 million to as much as $5.7 million. And again, these savings are mostly generated by management and classified positions. And we'll get to certificated positions in the last component. Next slide, please. And here you have the schools that have been considered or are being considered for closure: Prescott, Brookfield, Carl Monk, Parker. Next slide, please. Grass Valley, Horseman, and Korematsu. Those are the schools where we did a comprehensive analysis. And again, going back to the cost sheet, identifying the costs or potential savings that could be generated with the closures of these particular schools. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Holash to talk about this slide.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. So with any analysis, we have to use assumptions. So we figured class sizes at the closing schools going to the welcoming schools, they would be grades TK through 3 would not exceed 24:1. Grades 4 through 5 would not exceed the unduplicated pupil percentage maximum at the schools, 29 or 30. Students were divided equally among the welcoming schools, except for when a welcoming school did not have a TK. Then they went to the other schools that may have had a TK class. And data indicates there is enough room at the welcoming schools for the incoming students. Next slide, please.
So I'm going to take the baton on the assumptions associated with the financials. As I mentioned in the previous slides, a majority of the potential savings will come from the elimination of management and classified positions. We accounted for a possible 10% enrollment decrease as a result of closures. And we also used a cost allocation method for materials and supplies and operating expenses. And again, majority of the data that we use, the financial data, came directly from the first interim. We did account for restricted funding in routine restricted maintenance and also in management and classified positions that are being funded out of restricted funding. We did not include any revenue based on potential sale or lease of district property as a result of a merger or a closure. Next slide, please. Again, continuing with the financial assumptions, enrollment is based on future enrollment based on 22-23, and we received this information from the district. And the information about positions and the FTEs, full-time equivalents associated with the positions, came directly from the first interims into the first interim budget. And salaries of eliminated positions used an average salary for and benefits, and that also came from the first interim. And we're also assuming that the positions that are eliminated would not be backfilled in order to realize savings. Next slide, please. And here you have the list of schools that are being considered for closure, and we divided it into two categories: restricted funding in the middle column, and then in the far right column, you've got a combination of unrestricted and restricted funding. And when you look at the bottom line, you have the range that was mentioned at the beginning of this portion of the presentation for closures, 2.1, all the way up to possibly 5.7, 5.8 million. And a slight correction on Korematsu. Korematsu should be 353,225 for those of you that might be adding up the numbers. It does not change the bottom line. It's still 2.1 million for the bottom range. And again, this is for management and classified positions only. And it does include savings associated with material and supplies, operating expenses, routine restricted maintenance. Next slide, please.
Okay, and then I'll let me hand it off to Rick Holash, who will discuss the potential savings related to mergers. Go ahead, Rick.
Thanks, Mr. Dragon. So now we'll take a look at the mergers, the next layer we were looking at. Next slide, please. So this is where two schools basically merge into one, whether it's on the same campus or a different campus, as in the Westlake and West Oakland. This is showing savings of administrative, clerical, and classified costs. Next slide, please. So we have Rise and New Highland, which are also welcoming schools, which we'll discuss under the teachers, but they're becoming one campus together. Manzanita Community and Fruitvale would combine or merge into a school, Westlake and West Oakland. And then Community Day School, like Mr. Thomas said, we will take a look at after, because that was a small program. We want to make sure we have all the data correct on that. Next slide, please. Like I said, under the closures, we use pretty much the same assumptions here: 24 to 1, 29, 30 to 1. The merged schools, in some cases, are welcoming schools, and capacity exists at these schools. Next slide, please. Michael, I hand this off to you.
Thank you. And so this slide is similar to the slide that you saw in the closures, the schools that have been identified to merge and the appropriate savings, potential savings associated with each one of those schools. Again, you've got just restricted, and then a combination of restricted and unrestricted funding together. So that range is about $900,000 to $2.8 million in potential savings. Next slide, please.
Go ahead, Rick.
All right, this is our third layer, certificated staffing adjustments. Next slide, please. So here we're looking, we know when students move to welcoming schools, teachers will have to follow. We'll have larger cohorts, and there could be money to reinvest by the savings from teachers that could be displaced during this process. Next slide, please. So again, we use the certificated staffing for elementary schools on 2022-2023 class configuration. We use 24 to 1, 29, 30 to 1, depending on the grades. We also use merged schools were equally developed among the welcoming schools, except where TK was not an option at the welcoming school. If an odd number of students existed when we were trying to divide between the welcoming schools, then we applied that additional student or two to the school with the lowest enrollment. This analysis does not assume equal distribution of assumes equal distribution of students. We know once this is all done, we'll revisit it to see where the kids end up. Next slide, please. So in 2021, at the closing schools, we currently have 53 core teachers. In 2022-23, those schools were closed. We'd have 0 teachers at those sites. However, the welcoming schools in 2021-22, we currently have 177 core teachers teaching TK through 5th grade. In 22-23, based off of our projections of applying the kids from the closed schools to the welcoming schools, there would be required 219 positions at these schools. The merged schools at the elementary sites actually balance out, where Rise and New Highland would actually need 2 more teachers than currently combined. Korimatsu and Manzanita would leave two less. That's why the 43 there. Next slide, please. A graphical here. You can see 42 teachers would be moving to the welcoming schools. 53 teachers currently at the closure schools. Merged schools has nothing. The average teacher salary of $101,000. Savings could be at $1.1 million, or this could be reinvested or filling up some of the vacancies within the district. Next slide, please. This sort of shows it. Currently, there's 273 core classroom teachers at the closed schools potential for closure, welcoming schools, and the merged schools. In 2022-23, if everything were to occur, 262 classroom teachers would be needed. for a potential savings of 11 classroom teachers that could be reinvested somewhere else within the district. Next slide, please.
And this slide is a summary slide, and it essentially captures all of the different components with all of the savings ranges in each of the components. So for closure, the low end is 2.1, the high end 5.7. For merger, about $1 million on the low end, and on the high end 2.8 million. For certificated staffing, on the low end 1.1 million, and then on the high end 6.2. When you tally it all up, on the low end, potential savings of about 4.1 million, on the high end about $14.7 million. Next slide, please.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let me kind of wrap things up. I want to make a few things clear. When we talk about the low end being 4.1 million and the high end being 14.7 million, that is based on all the schools being considered are decided to are closed or merged. Should that not be the case, should the board make decisions other than that, meaning pick and choose which schools, those numbers will all have to be recalculated because all of these savings are literally interdependent in terms of the students moving, in terms of the staff moving. And so when we talk about the 4.1 million and the 14.7, recognize the 4.1 million is just unrestricted, assuming all the children go to all the schools that we believe they'll go to, the way we have based on our assumptions. And at the other end of the spectrum, the 14.7 million assumes that all of the unrestricted and restricted funding. Now, restricted funding, unrestricted funding can be used to help balance the budget. Restricted funding can be reinvested. In fact, for that matter, all $14.7 million can be reinvested based on a board's decision. And so, using the information I heard from the OUSD staff earlier, some of these opportunities that the board wants to reinvest these funds would be available should these decisions get made in this fashion. Next slide, please. So these are some of the considerations, some things to think about for everyone. Transportation, as we move some students around, some particularly special ed students, what are the implications on transportation costs? And those need to be addressed. Also, obviously, as schools close, I recognize the district has various central office structures, systems, processes, staffing levels. Those need to be reevaluated. That was not part of this analysis. Our analysis was focused primarily and solely on the school sites rather than the central office. And certainly, last but not least, the central office allocated staffing. We have staffing like custodians, I believe, primarily comes to mind, that are allocated out of the central office. And those should be looked at as well. Next slide. So the next steps from our vantage point is obviously if there are other analyses, particularly one comes to mind is the community day school, other analyses that the board may request, we would come back to the board with those with that analyses. And as I indicated earlier, once a final decision's been made, we would have to recalculate the savings. Next slide. That concludes our presentation. I want to, again, my sincerest thanks to the board of directors and to the staff and senior leadership of the Oakland Unified School District. I'll turn it over to you, Preston, if you're the person.
Thank you, Mr. Dragon, Mr. Holash, and Mr. Taylor. I think that concludes our presentation. So I will send it back to you, Superintendent Johnson Trammell, and that concludes the financial analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. That's actually the conclusion of the entire presentation. Board President Yee, I turn it over to you to facilitate public comment.
Thank you very much, Superintendent staff, for your detailed presentation. The presentation is included in the documents attached to the agenda item, along with the formal presentation and much more detail. And I refer the anybody watching to those 3 documents. I would like to now turn to the second part of this item, public comment. I would like to propose that we allocate 2 minutes per speaker for a total of 2 minutes if it's we adhere to the guidelines. Would any board members like to make a motion to do to agree to the 2 minutes, which is uncustomary for us, but within our guidelines?
No, the board bylaws say it's up to
I
3
have not
minutes.
recognized you yet, Mr. Hutchinson.
So what are you asking us to weigh in on then, please, Board President Yee?
I am proposing that we allocate 2 minutes per speaker. We have up to 3 minutes in our regular bylaws, and that we extend the time for 2 hours so that we can accommodate many of the speakers that are listed. Are there any board members who would like to make it? Is there a second? Mr. Hutchison, are you seconding?
No, I'm waiting to comment like you asked. So I raised my hand to wait this time because you yelled at me last time.
Mr. President, would you repeat the mover and seconder, please?
Director Thompson moved the item. And is there a second to the item?
Yes, I'll second.
President David. Okay, is there a comment on the item? Mr. Hutchison.
Yeah, thank you. So as I look at the Zoom, I can see that there's 1,830 people. So what you're saying with 2 minutes each for 2 hours, I'm going to do some quick OUSD math, and that means you're going to allow 60 people to speak out of the 1,800. That seems to be 1 out of 30, or roughly 3% and change. So is that how you want to run the meeting today? Allow 3% of the community who could even sign on to Zoom to participate? Because I won't agree to that. Thank you.
Any other comments on the motion to have a 1 hour public comment for 2 minutes per person, with the opportunity, of course, at the end of the time to make a motion to extend?
Mr. President, as I understood, it's 2 minutes and 2 hours.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, can we call the vote?
And the motion is stated. Student Director Powell?
Wait. I have an amendment to that I'd like to introduce. So I'd like the 2 minutes, but let's extend that to allow everyone to speak. So 2 minutes time 1,800, that would be 3,700 minutes. So I can do some quick math there too, and 60 hours. So let's extend this meeting for 2.5 days so we allow everyone to participate like we should. That's my amendment.
The current item has been moved and seconded, and we entertain comments. Can we call the vote?
On the motion to, as stated, Director Ng?
I'm sorry, Mr. Rickstraw. I need to jump in. There was a motion by Mr. Hutchinson.
Yeah, I heard no
second?
second. I heard no second.
Oh, okay. Just want to make sure. All right, go ahead.
On the motion as stated, Director Ng?
Yes.
Director Williams?
Yes.
Director Hutchinson?
I would never limit the community, no.
Director Gonzalez?
Yes.
Director Thompson?
Yes.
Vice President Davis?
Yes.
President Yee?
Yes.
Motion's adopted, 2 minutes, 2 hours.
Thank you. I would like to remind members of the public that you can provide e-comment via the Legislative Information Center on the OUSD website. And you can also email board members directly using our format, firstname.lastname@ousd.org. I know that the public has strong comments to voice. I am asking that you refrain from personal attacks, that you keep your remarks to the 2 minute time limit. I've asked Mr. Rickstraw and his team to keep track of the time and alert speakers as the 2 minutes approaches, so that I will be fully able to listen to each speaker. I'd like to, Mr. Hollis or Mr. Saturn, could you call the first speaker?
Yes, Mr. President, the first speaker we have is Henry Hitz.
Go ahead, please.
asking the speaker to unmute herself. Mr. President, should I move on to the next speaker?
Please.
The next speaker we have is Moses Amalak.
Hello, community. Sitting in Westlake's community. Can you all hear me?
Yes,
Thank you. Sitting in Westlake's Community Resource Center last week, I stared at my screen while you all sat in your homes, unfazed by the outcry of community members, parents, students, and OUSD staff. We cried out for transparency, community engagement, and for our schools to stay open, and you did nothing. Most schools being closed are predominantly Black and brown. So what happened to reparations for Black students? Closures don't actually save the district money, and I actually dare you to show me the receipts that they do. You made a mockery of your fellow board member, Mike Hutchison, as he held you all accountable to your duties to serve us. Gary Yee, repeatedly, I watched you dismiss voices by saying next as people spoke so passionately and cried out. We all get Robert's rule, but fuck, man, where's your humanity, y'all? Simply said, I witnessed elected officials being careless with the power that impacts many. As it stands, the majority of you are deficient in moral character. Heartbroken to be affiliated with you all, my disappointment and your lack of humanity has turned to rage. We are tired of asking and we are now demanding. No more school closures, y'all. So starting tomorrow, the first day of Black History Month, I'll be joining my fellow Warrior Eagle on a hunger strike. We will not eat until you end all school closures. You all don't want death on your hands, or maybe you do actually. So we're gonna see you out 1000 Broadway with our demands. And again, we will not eat until you all end your attack on our schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Let me end this other one. So I'm just asking you guys to please stand with the Oakland community and vote no on these proposed school closures. You voted to stop the school closures and double down by appealing to Tony Thurmond. This shows that this elected body knows that school closures do not save money and are fundamentally wrong. If you stand with the community, we can win. We are not scared of the threats from the state. We are willing to stand up and fight. The question is, are you willing to stand with your constituents who voted you in? It's a very disingenuous, only blame declining enrollment